What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and today we're doing another review roundup. If you guys haven't seen one of these before, I just take a couple of movies, maybe 3, maybe 4, in this case 2, and just talk about them here in a bit of a more condensed capacity. And so recently, I wanted to start covering some films that I've maybe covered on other people's channels, but do my own videos, as well as covering some films that I missed out on that came out recently that were really popular. And if you're like me and you're a big movie fan, every here and there's something that slips through the cracks, and then everybody starts to question your movie fandom at all because you just missed this popular film. And so I haven't seen the latest Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, which was nominated for a lot of awards this previous year, as well as was absolutely praised by viewers and critics alike. And yeah, I've yet to see it, but I figured, hey, why not, since I'm so late at this point, just go through the Shrek series and cover them here on the channel. I have done the Shrek movies before over on my buddy Jacob Martin's channel, but they were in much smaller capacity and over on his channel, and I wanted to do something specifically here for the channel, where it's just going to be me talking about the Shrek franchise. And so I figured, why not talk about Shrek and Puss in Boots, a spin-off which of course now has a sequel many years later that ended up being a huge success. So without further ado, let's get into my thoughts on Shrek. We're taking a trip back to 2001 for a film directed by Andrew Adamson and Vicky Jensen, and starring an all-star cast of people like Mike Myers, Eddie Murphy, Cameron Diaz, John Lithgow, and many, many more. Shrek. What can I say about this movie that has not already been said? There are just countless deep dives here on YouTube talking about this franchise and the individual films in the franchise. And like I said before, I have covered these movies in a shorter capacity over on my buddy Jacob Martin's channel years ago, but I knew it was always a franchise I was going to want to circle back around to and do specifically videos on my channel. So a big thanks to Jacob Martin for inviting me on to all those videos that we did in the past. And I'm happy today to be talking about the original Shrek, which it blows my mind to even think about it being over 20 years since this movie came out. It's the idea of that just breaks my brain. I was a kid when this movie came out, but I remember it vividly. I remember it being this, animated film that looked pretty solid, looked like a good time. It wasn't the breakout success that it would eventually become just yet. And I remember going to see it in theaters, and everybody was really a big fan of it. It turned into this worldwide phenomenon, getting, expansions in theme parks, as well as getting a bunch of like little spin-off, like straight to video extras and specials, of course spawning multiple sequels and spin-offs, video games. I mean, Shrek turned into an absolutely huge worldwide phenomenon for families and for kids and for adults as well, because Shrek of course is really well known for having a lot of adult humor, and this kind of being the counter programming to something like Disney. And if you've seen the Shrek films, you know that there are so many jabs made at Disney. Of course, similar to Disney, they borrow from a bunch of different popular fairy tales and lore that was established in books. And so of course it's not stuff that's specifically owned by Disney, but you can tell with the Shrek films that they go out of their way very often to specifically use characters and lore that's been used in Disney films and kind of give you an alternate take on it, oftentimes kind of throwing it to the wayside. Like in the case of this film, where we see Geppetto literally just selling off Pinocchio for some money, or we pretty much have the magic mirror calling Snow White easy or not so easy because she lives with 7 men.
Bachelorette number 2 is a cape-wearing girl from the land of fancy. Although she lives with 7 other men, she's not easy. Just kiss her dead, frozen lips and find out what a live wire she is. Come on, give it up for Snow White!
There are plenty of little jokes and jabs made at the fantastical franchises and lore that came before Disney that of course Disney would end up making a bunch of movies on. And so again, this is kind of like counter programming to Disney. A lot of it is to kind of make a jab at the popular Disney films that came before Shrek. And this is a film that underwent a lot of different stages before we'd eventually get the movie that we got. Of course, famously, Chris Farley was originally in the role to play Shrek, and things ended up falling through. Of course, Chris Farley would end up passing away, and it turned into a whole thing at the time. And then Mike Myers would end up getting the role, which of course at this point is the iconic voice behind Shrek. And so yeah, I remember being a kid, this was a huge deal when it first came out, but I remember going to see it before it became a big thing and just being absolutely lost in this world. And watching it today, I'm happy to say for me, this is still pretty much a perfect animated film. This is peak animation when it comes to the 2000s, in my opinion. I think that without a doubt, this is one of those animated films that still stands the test of time. And let's be completely and utterly honest, there are plenty of 3D films that came from the late 90s and the early 2000s that do not hold up today, or do not even hold a candle to the animation that we see today. And while this film does have some dated elements when it comes to its animation and certain things that are very specific to the 2000s, I think for the most part, the story, the heart, the charm, the musical score, the vocal performances, and just the overall world building still really stands the test of time. This was an absolute blast to go back and revisit. I found myself completely re-engaged in the story. Of course, I've seen this movie dozens of times at this point, so there is a bit of a nostalgic element to it for me here. But overall, just like watching the film, there are plenty of times I can go back and watch an old animated film that I grew up watching and say, yeah, you know, like that's nostalgic for me. I had a good time going back and revisiting it, but they aren't always substantial. They aren't always incredible. But watching this movie, I just was really kind of roped back in, and there was the end of sequences were coming by, and I kept finding myself thinking, man, this movie still really holds up. Like, I'm still really into these sequences. It all still looks really good. And so, of course, Mike Myers as Shrek, pretty fantastic. I think that he really captures this character who is, you know, feeling like an outcast, and this guy who just, of course, is kind of hateful and angry with the world because of the way that he is accepted, or the lack thereof of acceptance. And of course, at its core, this is a film that is about not judging a book by its cover. You know, there's the whole metaphor in this film about ogres having layers like onions, and I think overall that the core of this movie, and where it really has the most emotional part of it, really has the most to do with just, you know, not judging each other with how we look, how it's easy to judge somebody's appearance and assume they are one thing. But as you get to know people, you often realize that you have more in common with them than you actually think. And that's, of course, most solidified with the character Fiona, which is, of course, the princess that Shrek is sent to save in this film, played by Cameron Diaz. He has to go and fight a dragon who ends up falling in love with Donkey. Of course, he's doing this for Lord Farquaad, who is a very short king or prince who wants to be a king and now needs a princess to marry in order to become a king. So he ends up sending Shrek on this death mission, this suicide mission, to go and save this princess named Fiona, which he does not know has a very special secret, which is at night she ends up becoming an ogre herself, which ends up connecting her and Shrek, and then there's a love tale that ensues. Of course, at this point, I feel like all of you guys have seen this movie, so there's really not much to say when it comes to the narrative here. Of course, this is also based on a book that was written by William Steig. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce his name, and this would eventually be made into a movie, obviously. And it's just crazy to see the legacy that Shrek has had. It was nice to go back and revisit it. I just think that when it comes to the musical choices, not only in the musical score and composition, but also in the soundtrack, there are so many great hits that are very specific to the late 90s and early 2000s, of course, but that just really just put a smile on your face when you're watching this movie. There are so many needle drops that are just so funny at times and just perfectly placed. I think that this is one of the best soundtracked movies in terms of using music that was outside of this movie, or pop culture music, in the perfect moments for a movie like this, that have still remained incredibly iconic revisiting the film today. And like I mentioned before, the animation does have some dated elements, but for the most part, it still really rings true. I think that the animation has aged incredibly well. There are so many moments of emotion that do work because of the nuance given to the characters on their faces. And like I mentioned before, there's plenty of 3D animation from this era that still doesn't hold up today. A lot of times because they just lose the emotionality when it comes to the characters, and it feels like some of the characters can be a little rigid and stiff. But thankfully, in the case of Shrek, the emotion is still there, not only in the vocal performances, but also in the animation. One of the funniest things I did find about the animation that definitely dated it, though, for sure, was the fact that there are plenty of times where you'll see the exact same faces of various random characters and just non-speech characters that are around the world, that just have various different kinds of outfits on, or different facial hair, that pretty much was just going to show that they were using the same models, but just kind of having to interchange clothing and facial hair and hair to kind of, you know, utilize the limited amount of 3D models they had for this movie. So that's definitely something that dates the film, but also gives it a charm, because going back and revisiting it, I just found myself kind of having a laugh with that element of the film. And I think it just goes without saying at this point that Shrek is a great movie. I just wanted to talk about it here a little bit on the channel, and I just want to open you guys up to the conversation of letting me know what Shrek was like for you when you were growing up. Did you dive into it kind of before it was super popular and then kind of get to see that rise as the sequels came out? Or was it something that maybe you jumped onto way later when Shrek had already become a worldwide phenomenon? For me, Shrek is forever going to be one of my favorite animated films of all time. And going back and revisiting the film for the first time in quite a few years at this point, it is just so amazing to me how well this film still holds up, and I look forward to revisiting it in the future. So now we're going to jump 10 years into the future and talk about the spin-offs to these films, Puss in Boots. Directed by Chris Miller, who actually directed Shrek the Third, this film stars Antonio Banderas as Puss in Boots, Salma Hayek as Kitty Softpaws, Zach Galifianakis as Humpty Dumpty, as well as people like Billy Bob Thornton and Amy Sedaris. So while I'm super well versed in the Shrek films, especially the first 3 Shrek films, and I've seen Puss in Boots before, this was easily the only film in the entirety of the Shrek franchise that I had only seen one time when it originally released in theaters. And this past Christmas, I actually got the Blu-ray set of every single film in the Shrek franchise, including Shrek the Musical, which I do intend on covering here on the channel as well. And Puss in Boots was in this collection, and so I was really excited for that, because with the sequel having come out and I missed it, I figured I needed a bit of a refresher on the first Puss in Boots, and I figured why not cover the original Shrek film and the original Puss in Boots here in one review roundup as we make our way through the Shrek franchise. Of course, it's a little out of order, but since this is an origin story for Puss in Boots, I figured it would be okay to do it in this order. Going into this movie, I didn't really remember an abundance about it outside of the characters that were involved. I knew Humpty Dumpty was involved, and I knew that Kitty Softpaws was involved, but I wasn't really recollecting what the story was here, and if I was really even going to enjoy the film, because it wasn't really one that clung on with me. But after having watched the film again, I can definitely say that I don't feel like it necessarily soars at the same heights that the best Shrek films do. However, I can definitely say that I enjoyed the film a lot, and it's by no means a bad film. The base premise of this film is like I said, it is a setup for the character of Puss in Boots, and we most notably learn about his past with the character of Humpty Dumpty, played by Zach Galifianakis. And so pretty much we learned that as kids, they had this dream to find these magical beans, which of course are the beans of legend with the beanstalk and, you know, Jack and the Beanstalk, that narrative. They're looking for those beans. You have Jack and Jill, who end up getting involved in this narrative as some villains throughout the course of it. And the main core of it is that when we first see Puss in Boots, he's been years apart from his friendship from Humpty Dumpty, and then we get some flashbacks that give us a little bit of information on how things went down with them, and how at the end of it, Humpty Dumpty felt betrayed by Puss in Boots, but all these years later is asking him to finally go on this journey because he knows where the magical beans are. And along the way, they end up also having Kitty Softpaws, who's joining them on this adventure. Spoilers if you haven't seen this film before, but it turns out that Humpty Dumpty was only playing Puss in Boots to just betray him in return all these years later. And at its core, this is a fairly simple story that seems familiar. It's something that you've seen plenty times in tons of other films, fantasy films, kid films, family films, whatever the case may be. And so because of that, there is far more of a predictability when it comes to this film than it comes to the other Shrek films. And while some of the other Shrek films definitely have predictability, there's at least able to be some twists and turns and surprises because of how ridiculous those films can be at times. But in the case of Puss in Boots, it's a little bit safer when it comes to a narrative that is a little bit closer to home, something that people can just kind of relate to and have seen a dozen times. But with that said, though, it's still done in a really fun and playful way. I think the voice performances are really great here. And one of the highlights of the entirety of the Shrek franchise is really great animation. Like I said, there's definitely things that date them at times because they came out in the early 2000s. And of course, 3D animation today is absolutely stunning. But it doesn't take away from the artistic charm that the films have. And in the case of this film, I think that it's, consistent with the other Shrek films. The performances are solid throughout. The animation is really nice and crisp. This coming out 10 years after the original Shrek, it definitely has the advantage of having far better animation in some of those moments, a lot more detail when it comes to things like the fur on Puss in Boots and characters like Kitty Softpaws, and overall really enjoy the aesthetics of the film. And while the story might be familiar, I really found that the characters are what made this movie enjoyable. The relationship between Humpty Dumpty and Puss in Boots that's set up in the flashbacks of this film, I found to be really heartfelt, and I found myself really enjoying those moments between them. And when they do have moments that are conflicting their relationship, I think for the most part it's all done really, really well, because the story allows you to feel for these two characters that just kind of have drifted apart, but oftentimes do still have a lot of care for one another, which does end with a bit of a happy ending kind of storyline, with the two of them kind of reconvening, even with betrayal having happened near the end of the film. And then I really enjoy the chemistry between Puss in Boots and Kitty Softpaws. I think that Salma Hayek as well as Antonio Banderas just really understood how to bring a lot of romance. Of course, those two actors have worked together in various other things in the past, and I was just really happy to see them both in this movie back then and revisiting it today. It still just really works. I think that they bring a lot to the characters, and the animators do a great job of bringing a lot of nuance with the performances to make you really care about these two characters. And while some of their screen time can be a little bit limited, the time that they do spend together is charming, and I found myself really enjoying it. So I'm happy to say that starting this off, the first two Shrek films we're talking about here in the franchise, Shrek and its spin-off all these years later, Puss in Boots, I thought they were a really great time. I really enjoyed watching both. I thought they were a really great time. I really had a good time I thought they were a really good time. I had a fantastic time going back and revisiting these movies in general. And I look forward to checking out Shrek 2, Shrek the Third, Shrek Forever After, as well as leading up to Puss in Boots The Last Wish, which I do plan on checking out very soon. I know that I'm super late to the party when it comes to talking about that one, but I am looking forward to talking about it and the rest of the Shrek films here on the channel. And so, of course, this is a very positive review. I enjoyed these films. I don't think there's anything about them that really is terrible or bad. I think Shrek is a fantastic film, near perfect when it comes to its genre. And I think Puss in Boots, while it's not perfect and top tier in the Shrek franchise, I still find it to be a good time with some familiar story beats that just make it kind of predictable and nothing that's overly new and fresh, but it still has a lot of fun to be had. So overall, two solid movies, one that's damn near perfect for me and one that's definitely a fun watch. So definitely want to hear what you guys have to say. Are you a fan of the Shrek franchise? Which is your favorite in the franchise? And which is your favorite of these two? Are you one of the people who maybe enjoy Puss in Boots more than Shrek? Or for you, is Shrek going to be top tier all the time? Definitely want to hear what you guys have to say, so leave any and all comments down below. Hit that like button if you guys enjoyed the video, because it definitely helps the channel out. And I'll see you beautiful people in the next video, the next Shrek video, and whatever the hell I decide to talk about. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.